So yes, traffickers are using tech, but we can use it to help flip the equation. Modern slavery isn't as big a problem as people make it out to be. This just isn't true. It's a huge problem. Almost 50 million people are currently enslaved across the world, more than at any time in human history. And it's also an almost $500 billion industry, making it the second most lucrative criminal market. And it's only getting worse. The number of detected trafficking victims has quadrupled since 2012, while convictions have remained static. So it is a big problem. Human trafficking is too complicated. We'll never shut it down. Yes, trafficking is really complex, but that doesn't mean we're powerless. And there are already really interesting examples of how we're fighting the issue. For example, Stop the Traffic's Traffic Analysis Hub is pooling data from 650 users globally, including banks, tech companies, NGOs and the private sector, to identify trafficking hotspots and routes, and using that to enable targeted law enforcement interventions. In 2020, the US Customs and Border Agency exposed forced labour by a palm oil producer in Malaysia and issued a withhold release order blocking imports from that producer. And this blocked $500 million worth of imports and led to several high-profile companies cutting ties with the producer. So it is already happening and there is hope, but we just need it to be scaled. Why should the UK take on the responsibility when we're not the problem? Well, actually, that's just not true. So in the UK, there's demand for things like cheap labour and commercial sex, which is part of what traffickers respond to. So in the UK, there's 60,000 men and women in commercial sexual exploitation, and that's because that's the size of the market demand here. So the UK is part of the problem, but we can also be part of the solution. It's now almost impossible to go off-grid. How do we lose track of trafficking victims? So yeah, it feels like almost no one can go off-grid anymore. But that's what traffickers do. They thrive on keeping their victims invisible. But victims are often hidden in plain sight, and most of us will have interacted with someone who's been trafficked at least once in our lives. But traffickers keep victims silent through trapping them in kind of debt bondage, threatening them with violence and torture, and controlling their movement. The police don't have the right tools to stop trafficking. Yeah, that's true. It's a cross-sector issue, and it will require the police, tech companies, banks, and the rest of the private sector to really work together and share data to solve the issue. And also, that in the UK, there's currently 43 police forces that all work separately and rely on kind of incompatible databases that prevent them from sharing data with each other. They're set up in a 20th century way to solve 21st century crime. Technology has made it basically impossible to catch traffickers. It's true, traffickers are using digital tools to scale and conceal their operations. And in this case, traffickers are ahead of the state in the way that they use technology. But that is precisely why we need to use technology to fight back and dismantle the systems that enable exploitation. We need to get tougher on traffickers, not waste time implementing computer software. Totally agree. But it's not about implementing just a random IT system. So Stop the Traffic's Traffic Analysis Hub uses AI machine learning models to track trafficking hotspots and routes in real time. For example, through data sharing on that platform, they were able to identify a scam compound in Southeast Asia and shared that information with law enforcement there, who successfully freed victims. So it's not just theoretical, it is actually working, and it's not just a small piece of computer software. It's a kind of larger scale initiative that can make exploitation less viable. Why are we relying on reactive arrests when technology could prevent exploitation before it starts? I totally agree. Right now, law enforcement is focused on kind of targeting low-level offenders through the courts, rather than dismantling the systems that make exploitation viable. Through AI and tech platforms, we can restrict traffickers' ability to use the legitimate financial system, and that means undermining their ability to operate. I bet TBI thinks that we can tackle this with digital ID. Well, yes, we actually do. A digital ID system would actually be a really powerful way of stopping exploitation. At the moment, traffickers thrive on being able to take away victims' physical identification, and a digital ID system would mean that people have access to a secure online identification that nobody can take away. Isn't this just another excuse to invade our privacy? No. Digital ID would actually give you more control over your data and who you share it with, and likewise, this would put control back in victims' hands. Biometrics are just a way to get us all on a database and keep tabs on us. So no, it is completely valid to worry about privacy, especially when it comes to data, but this isn't about keeping tabs on people, and many UK banks are already employing behavioural biometrics in really amazing ways. And it's not about kind of looking at you personally, but it's looking at how people kind of type or interact with an app and to identify kind of red flags for criminal behaviour. So it's not about collecting data on you, but it's about protecting people and identifying criminal behaviour so that it doesn't go further. Traffickers act like businesses, so why don't we fight them like one? This is true, traffickers do act like businesses. They're structured and highly driven by profit, and that means we should treat them like that. But the problem is, law enforcement is currently focused on targeting low-level offenders through the courts, rather than targeting the business model of trafficking itself. So there was a really interesting partnership that the National Crime Agency did with several UK banks. It was a data-sharing initiative where they tracked criminal proceeds flowing through the legitimate financial system, and they were able to uncover 8 new criminal networks and cut off those proceeds before further harm was done. What that kind of partnership does is raise the risks for traffickers and reduce the rewards, making exploitation less viable. So yes, traffickers are using tech, but we can use it to flip the equation and stop exploitation at scale.